Prior to passage of the labor bill by the Senate, Senator Jennifer McEwen, chair of the Senate Labor Committee, praised what she called a beautiful, glorious 275-page bill that aims to improve the lives of a broad spectrum of workers. She joins me now to talk about some of the provisions in the new law. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, some aspects of the bill have already gone into effect, some will soon, and yet others, like paid sick leave, will take effect on January 1st of next year. Duluth, St. Paul, and Minneapolis already require what's called earned sick and safe time, which allows workers in those cities to accrue paid leave over time, I think 30 hours of work for 1 hour of leave. Why was now the time to make this a statewide benefit?
Well, thanks for that question. I think that the reason why now is the time to make this a statewide benefit is that the same reason that we put many of these provisions into this comprehensive labor package, which is that all workers, whether they live in the metro or Duluth or our metro centers, or they live in other areas of the state, deserve to have this very basic benefit. This means that you will be able to take time off that is paid from work when you are sick. It's just very, very basic stuff. And it's unfortunate that we didn't do this years ago, frankly, in Minnesota, a state that prides itself on workers' rights and protections. To not have this apply to every single worker in the state was a problem and a mistake. So we're really, along with a lot of other provisions in this bill, correcting and bringing things up to date, where I think probably some people assumed they already had this right or they should have this right. And as we know, it varies from profession to profession as well. So people working in certain professions have had that benefit and have been able to count on that benefit largely through the organizing of organized labor over years to make that the expectation. But as we know, many workers in our society, especially those with jobs that are lower paid with less benefits, haven't been able to count on that. And those jobs are sort of notorious for having high turnover and workers that are not paid in a way and don't receive the kind of benefits that they would need to support themselves and their families. And that has to change. So that's one fundamental piece toward making that change.
The new law creates an ergonomics program within the Department of Labor and Industry that will modernize how the state approaches the types of musculoskeletal injuries that occur in workplaces like healthcare facilities, warehouses, and meatpacking sites. What is the goal of this?
Well, we're very excited about these changes to the ergonomics program, and I think the Department of Labor and Industry is really excited to gear up on this. And we heard testimony in our Labor Committee over the course of the session from a number of different workers talking about the kinds of injuries that they're facing now. And I think it goes to, again, the changing nature of work over decades. We have a lot of people working service sector jobs or working in healthcare, doing the types of jobs where they may not be receiving the types of injuries that people who are doing some of the hard labor in manufacturing plants or the mines or different professions where we've already been cued into those types of injuries and what they mean. But these workers matter too, and their injuries matter too. They matter to them, they matter to their families, and making sure that those workers are protected is, again, part of adjusting our laws and our policy to account for the reality of today in the workplace.
Along those lines, the new law also establishes a Safe Workplaces for Meat and Poultry Processing Workers Act, which will give workers the right to refuse work under dangerous conditions while ensuring that they are still paid and that they are not retaliated against. It also requires annual training and establishes a workers' rights coordinator. What is the intent then?
To protect these workers. This is some of the most dangerous work in our economy, is the processing of meats, poultry and meats, and really making sure that those workers who are doing some of that most dangerous work are taken care of is, again, just a fundamental piece that frankly should have been in place already. And a lot of those workers are also migrant workers, a certain percentage of them, and they are, as such, very vulnerable. Some of them in having language barriers, having barriers with documentation or paperwork. They need these protections. And we saw over the course of the pandemic as well, those workers really took a hit for our entire economy to keep us going. And so just these basic protections to make sure that they will be protected physically and economically in their work it's just fundamental.
Warehouse workers will also have expanded workplace protections beginning on August 1st. Employees will now be given a written description of a work quota, and the law stipulates that those quotas must not interfere with necessary break times. Workers will also be able to request a detailed report about their performance. Why are these changes necessary?
We heard, again, testimony in the Senate Labor Committee this year from some of these warehouse workers about the conditions that they're working under. And I think for people who haven't worked in a warehouse like this, we may not quite understand until we hear that detailed testimony of what this is like. They reported to us really being treated like cogs in a machine, literally being treated in this way, that they're not living, breathing human beings in need of breaks, in need of a sense of knowing what is being expected of them. So they reported instances of changing expectations over the course of a shift, not knowing what expectation they were being required to meet. So never really truly knowing, always sort of on the edge of knowing if they're performing adequately, if they're meeting the quota that they need to meet, because it could change, in fact, during their shift, and then they could be retaliated against or punished in some way for not meeting that quota that they didn't even know existed or what it was. So these very simple pieces of legislation of just providing basic information to workers, to people, the people doing these jobs, these basic jobs in our economy, about what's expected of them and what they should know these things. These are very basic things about, and we heard that repeatedly in our committee. This was a repeated theme of people being treated like machines, like they are not actually living, breathing people. And so these laws and these policies in place are designed to say, hold up here, you need to treat these people with respect.
Another new provision is a Nursing Home Workforce Standards Board, which will establish minimum standards in nursing homes, including wages and training standards. Is this an effort to professionalize the nursing home workforce and perhaps make this field more attractive to workers?
I hope so, and especially in regard to the high turnover that we see in this field. We hear it from the people who are running our nursing homes and our care facilities about their struggles in terms of being able to pay the kind of wages that people should expect to be paid, living wages, and then their struggles with maintaining an adequate workforce. So a lot of this provision goes toward is boosting up workforce in this area, allowing people to be able to stay in these jobs, to have some agency over their working conditions and their pay, to be able to organize around these things, and really boosting up that area as a whole.
And then one more question before we go. According to the Pew Research Center, the share of U.S. workers who belong to a union has fallen since 1983, when 20% of workers were union members. Last year, only 10% of workers belonged to a union. That may be changing as news outlets continually report about different groups seeking to unionize. A law change in Minnesota is now that so-called captive audience meetings are banned, meaning that employers cannot require their employees to attend meetings about unionization or to deter unionization or to talk about politics or religion. So what does this mean for workers?
Well, it's interesting that you started with a number from the 80s, because previous to the 80s, that number was much higher than 20%. In the heyday of the middle class and the creation of the middle class of our country, unionization was very commonplace. And I think we need to go back and just take a look at what unionization is. What it is workers being able to organize themselves together in a workplace so that they can bargain collectively together. They can come together. They can decide what they want changed in their workplace. workplace or want to be better. And then they can go as a group to have that discussion with their employer together in solidarity, so that the employer has to listen to them because they're organized together as a group. It's not just individual employees trying to bargain with the employer. It's together they are doing that so that they have more power and more of an ability to have their demands met. That's all unionization is. It's very, very simple. It's a very simple human rights imperative that people should have. And so I think that, as we have seen the decline of unionization, we have also seen an increase in wealth disparity in our country overall. It's a huge problem. It is terribly destabilizing for our economy, for our politics. And I think we've seen the fruits of that over these recent decades, where we have an entire class of people in the United States and in Minnesota who are terribly underpaid, working 2 to 3 jobs, not being treated with respect in their work, not being shown dignity in their work. And it doesn't have to be that way. One job should be enough to support a family. It should be enough to support yourself, to be able to go on vacations, to enjoy life, to seek other pursuits. But our economy, our capitalist-driven economy, has been working and grinding people down to the point where I think some people have forgotten what unionization could mean, but the newer generations coming up are looking back and are seeing that promise of what solidarity and union organizing could mean for their lives. And so we are seeing this invigoration of unionization across the country and in Minnesota, and I'm very hopeful for that.
Senator Jennifer McEwen, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much for having me.